if you don't want anything recorded of you, you can adjust your settings. So please do that. And it is recording. Okay. So I'm Lauren Walker. I am the executive director of the Hawaii Friends of Restorative Justice. We've been hosting these innovative speaker series. We started last year when COVID happened. We thought it was interesting to get people who are really creative to bring new energy and ideas to these kind of, hard times right now. So we had Ellen Langer from Harvard, who I think, Phil, was your student, right, Ellen?
Yeah, she was my first student at NYU in the Bronx back in early 1960s.
Wow.
She was the best student ever. Brilliant.
Yeah. And she's the first woman to be tenured in psychology at Harvard.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah. She's done great work in mindfulness.
Yeah.
And then we also had Shad Maruna, who's a criminologist, American, but lives in Ireland. And he talked about desistance theory. And then we also had Howard Zare, who's known as the grandfather of restorative justice, and John Braithwaite from Australia. And now we're so thrilled to be talking with Phil Zimbardo, who is wonderful. And I want to thank everybody for joining in us with this today, coming and contributing, donating. This is a fundraiser. We've used all of these talks as a fundraiser for a higher and remedial education program that we're piloting for women imprisoned in Hawaii. Hawaii it's so sad, our people in prison, they only have grade level, the average grade level is 4th to 6th grade. But wow, we have some women who have college. And we're making those women are being trained to be tutors for the lower educated women, and they're going to help them get GEDs. They're going to be tutors for GEDs. So we're thrilled about this new program. And you guys, we're also buying some correspondence courses. And this talk today is supporting a woman to get a correspondence course from because we can't have online classes in our prison. And so we do a paper correspondence course. And so you guys are contributing to that too. Today, I want to also welcome our board members who are here. Right next to me is Leela Blems Goldstein, who is one of our board members, and also Ian Crabb, who is online, I believe, who is also a board member and with us today. And I think that Jeannie Lum and Allison Jacobs, who work with us, are on this. And also we have the great Hannah Humphreys, who is our intern for spring. And I'm going to introduce Professor Scott Plous, who has kindly offered to introduce Phil Zimbardo. And so Scott Plous was a student of Professor Zimbardo's at Stanford, and he was his advisor for his PhD. And Scott's gone on, and he has been a psychology professor at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And he is a fellow with the American Psychological Association and has received national awards, really prestigious national awards for his work. But what he's probably really well known for is founding and directing a nonprofit membership organization. And now I forgot to write it down. It's like Psychology Net, right, Scott? What's it called?
Social Psychology Network.
Yeah, I've heard of this. And it is a fabulous organization with the mission of promoting peace, social justice, and sustainable living through public education, research, and the advancement of psychology. Scott has a strong devotion to action teaching, which is a model he developed for real world social problems. So thank you so much, Scott, for introducing Professor Zimbardo for us.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. Aloha, everyone, and mahalo to Lauren for the invitation to introduce one of my dearest friends, Phil Zimbardo. Even though Phil and I have a very, very long history, this is actually the first time that I've ever been asked to introduce him at any event. So it's kind of amazing. So away we go.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so can you see the slides now in full? Terrific. All right, my first contact with Phil was...
I don't see slides.
You don't see slides?
Nope. I
Do
see,
others?
I see just the introductory slide.
Yes, you should see, I think that's the slide, Phil,
Okay,
with your name and your image.
right.
That's it.
Okay.
So I was saying we go back 40 years to 1981 when I was a first year grad student in psychology at Stanford. I had just won a small award, and the department administrator made a little announcement through a small memo that she circulated. She stuffed in the boxes of students and faculty. And much to my astonishment, the very next day, I received a handwritten note on this memo stuffed back into my mailbox. And what it was is just a note from Phil. I kept it to this day. I doubt very much that Phil even remembers that this ever happened. And what you can see that he wrote on the bottom was, to Scott Plous, congratulations, we're proud of you. I was really floored by this on two counts. First, I was really surprised that Phil Zimbardo, who was by then already world renowned, he seemed to be in every intro psych textbook, that he was still alive. Somehow I thought, in my graduate student brain, that when somebody's that famous and so on, they've already had a long, productive career many years ago. Didn't realize that his most famous study, the Stanford Prison Experiment, which he's going to talk about today, had taken place only 10 years before, when he was a relative kid in his 30s. And the second thing that really surprised me was that somebody as prominent and as busy as Phil was even back then would take the time to write a note of support to a nobody first year student whom he didn't even meet. It wasn't like I was his student, large department, and yet he thought it was important enough to do that. What I've learned since then is that this actually isn't all that unusual for Phil. It is simply how he moves through the world. He has a sweet spot, a legendary sweet spot for students and for kids. And so if you'll allow me to just say a few words about the personal side of Phil before we turn to the professional. He absolutely loves kids, and they adore him right back. And you can see that in these photos of Phil with my daughter, who we were talking about a little bit earlier, who calls him Uncle Phil and is just crazy about him. The other personal note I wanted to mention is that even before the Stanford Prison Experiment, Phil has really always been a passionate advocate for peace, social justice, yes, restorative justice, and human rights. For example, in the 1960s, he led a student walkout in protest of the Vietnam War. And after Martin Luther King Jr. took a public stand against the war, Phil actually wrote him a letter of support, which I found kind of astonishing. Somebody was at the archives, the King archives, found the letter, sent it to Phil, and he thought I'd be interested and gave me a copy as well. So these are long-standing passions that are really defining passions of Phil's. But now some professional notes. If you read on Lauren's website, Phil's biographical sketch for today's event, you already know that he is a professor emeritus of psychology at Stanford, where he taught psychology for more than 50 years. You know that he was elected president of the American Psychological Association by a landslide, I should add. People don't usually say that sort of thing, but the votes would tell that. And by the way, he was also twice elected president of the Western Psychological Association. So he's no stranger to Hawaii. You know that he wrote and narrated the award-winning PBS series Discovering Psychology, and you might recall from the biography that he has over 600 publications, including more than 60 books, only one of which, is the New York Times bestseller, The Lucifer Effect, which, as I recall, devotes something like 200 pages to the Stanford Prison Experiment. It's the single largest treatment in the greatest detail if you want to learn about that study. What you might not know about Phil, however, is that he actually retired 4 years before writing this book. And this book is not a small book. This is a tome. It is over 500 pages. Phil, I can't remember exactly, but I think that the original manuscript was pushing 1,200 or 1,500 pages. They had you cut, I know, several hundred pages, but it's still a magnificent work, a huge work. And yet that is only one out of dozens of what Phil sometimes calls retirement projects. Two other projects worth noting that he undertook after his retirement were to help redesign the Stanford Prison Experiment website and to release a DVD version of Quiet Rage, a documentary on the study. If you would like to learn more about the prison study after today's talk, the prisonexp.org website, which I manage at Wesleyan as part of that social psychology network that Lauren mentioned, is a really easy place to start. I just looked last night. It's had 178 million page views, and it has all sorts of archival materials from the study, as well as critiques and responses from Phil and others associated with the study, the research. And the Quiet Rage documentary is another good place to start. In fact, after the Abu Ghraib prison abuses in Iraq came to light, US guards at Abu Ghraib were required to watch the Quiet Rage DVD in an effort to help them understand what can go wrong and to prevent abuses from happening in the future. It was required viewing. When Phil retired in 2003, the Social Psychology Network team also created a website for well-wishers to post messages for Phil, which in true Zimbardo style turned out to be epic. He ended up receiving 770 messages from people in 29 countries around the world. And the messages did not just say, you know, have a happy retirement. Many of them spoke in very moving ways about the effect that Phil had had on their life, their career, and so forth. All told, 143 of these messages, about 1 out of every 5, used the word inspiring or inspirational or inspired or some other variant along those lines. One of my personal favorite messages simply said, Phil Zimbardo retiring is the perfect oxymoron. Unfortunately for all of us, this message proved to be absolutely on target. So here we are 18 years after Phil is retired. In today's event, I have no doubt that you're going to see firsthand why so many people do find him inspiring. He'll be talking about the Stanford Prison Experiment and prison reform, but also talking about the Heroic Imagination Project, which he launched roughly a dozen years ago, yes, in retirement. And it is a groundbreaking and inspiring project in its own right. But now let me just conclude with a brief note of thanks. In a 2013 commencement address that Phil gave at the University of Puget Sound, he spoke with students about what he felt it takes to lead a fulfilling life. And the very first principle that he mentioned was to use time wisely and well. Time, he said, is our most precious asset, never to be wasted and always to be used mindfully. Knowing how Phil feels about the value of time, let me end by thanking him for sharing his time with us today. With that, I give you my teacher, my mentor, and my longtime dear friend, Phil Zimbardo.
Thank you, Scott, for an amazing introduction. I am really honored and pleased. We've always had such a great personal relationship and professional relationship and family relationship. Every APA, when APA was visitable, we would always have breakfast with Scott, I, and his daughter. at some elegant restaurant. And so I missed that in recent years. So where do we begin? So I'm wearing my last copy of the Stanford Prison Experiment t-shirt to put us in this realm. And actually on August 14th, 2021, it'll be the 50th anniversary of the Stanford Prison Experiment, which is to me amazing. I'm happy that I've survived it. I got a couple more months to go. And there are 2 documentary films competing, being made about the study. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about is why I did this study, what the you know, what came out of it, um, how do we understand prisons and power any better because of that study, and what are the follow-ups to that study, and of course, given we're talking about restorative justice, I want to slip in something that has long been forgotten. There's something called Guantanamo Bay Prison, which started after 9/11 to put terrorists there in 2002. Originally, there were 780 of them. Now, only 40 remain. Some have been transferred, and many have died. Uh, uh, nine died in custody, I just discovered, and 41 had unsuccessful suicides. So it's a horrible place. And my understanding is it costs American taxpayers millions, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars to maintain this huge place. There are more prison guards than there are prisoners now, and nobody knows what to do with it. I mean, these remaining 41, the remaining 40 prisoners are in this huge place, and we no longer have good relationships with Cuba because they are a communist nation. And for me, this is one of the examples of the worst thing about incarceration. So we put these people there because they were a threat to the United States. But there's something called federal prisons in America. Those 41 prisoners should be sent to our federal prison if you want in maximum custody, and we could shut down that Guantanamo base, turn the land over to Cuba, and save millions of dollars for us taxpayers. That's just an aside. So again, as Scott mentioned, the study, which was really designed as a simple demonstration of the power of situations to make good people do bad things. And the context of the study in 1971 was that in psychology, the big push had always been, we can understand and predict behavior only by understanding individual personality traits. And so this was a whole notion of individualism, personality traits. It fit with American individualistic orientation. And I, and later Scott and other social psychologists said, no, that's not the case. That we are the situations we live in. We are the situation that situational forces shape us to behave for better or for worse. So when we did the study, we began by measuring the personality traits on standard scales of all the prisoners and all the guards. And then at the end, we say which of these personality traits predicted to anything. And the answer was 0. They predicted to nothing. I think the only one I can remember roughly is the prisoners who lasted longer, who didn't break down, were higher on authoritarian personality. So they were able to survive in an authoritarian environment, which is what that became. But other than that, nothing predicted anything. What predicted anything, though, was whether you were randomly assigned to the role of prisoner or guard. Now, nobody wanted to be a guard. Why? In 1971, we were still in the Vietnam War. Students were protesting everywhere. I started earlier in the 60s when I was at New York University in the Bronx. And when students protested, in many cases, the administration of the college university would call the police on the campus to quell the riots. And there were, in many cases, physical confrontations between the police and students. So students hated students hated the police. In fact, we would say, oink, oink, the police are pigs. And so when we interviewed the prisoners, when we interviewed all the people who answered our ad to be in a study of prison life that would go 1 to 2 weeks, 78 people answered the ad. The first thing we said, do you want to be a prisoner or a guard? And 0, nobody wanted to be a prison guard. Now that's really important, because you say, well, the terrible things that the guards did was because they had latent sociopathic tendencies. No, nobody wanted to be a guard because they didn't want the burden of that power. And for students, that power was always used negatively against them, and negatively in a non-democratic way. So we began this study, and what made it special that people, in thinking about it, don't realize is what made it special was that I had prearranged with the Palo Alto Police Department to make mock arrests. That the boys who were randomly assigned to be prisoners, we simply said, wait in the dormitories. These are students from all over America. Only 2 of them were Stanford students. They were just finishing summer school at Stanford or Berkeley. And so some were in dormitories. And the Palo Alto police made mock arrests, meaning they went there, asked for the name of prisoner. Are you Doug Corpy? And then read them the Miranda rights, handcuffed them, put them in the back of a police car, had the sirens wailing, took them downtown to the real police jail. They did a formal booking, fingerprinting, photograph, put a blindfold on, put them in a real prison cell. And at that moment, they didn't know where they were. They knew that they knew they were volunteered for the experiment. It must be that. But the police were very serious and very, very not taking any bullshit. And so, in fact, if the prisoners started making fun of this, they would really hold their shoulder and say, look, kid, you broke the law and you're going to go to jail. And at that point, then Craig Haney and Kurt Banks, who are my graduate students, would come down, get the prisoner, put them in our car, bring them to our jail, which is in the basement of the psychology department in Jordan Hall. Next thing, so they had the blindfold on that the police put on. Our guards stripped them naked, and they're standing naked in front of a big mirror and take the blindfold off, and there you are. Welcome to the Stanford Prison Experiment. We begin by dehumanizing you. And then, so that took the whole day to arrest. There were 9 guards, and 9 guards each worked 8-hour shifts on 3 guards in each 8-hour shift, morning, afternoon, evening. And there were 9 prisoners, 3 in each of 3 cells. And then, of course, we had standby guards and standby prisoners. And then the experiment began. And at the end of day 1, I said to Kurt and Craig, and there was an undergraduate, David Jaffe, who played the role of warden. I said, this is a waste of time. We put in too much effort to create this whole environment. Nothing's happening. And nothing's happening because the guards put the prisoners in their cell and sat outside smoking a cigarette in the yard. And then the morning, what happened though that transformed everything, on the morning of the second day, the prisoners rebelled. Why did they rebel? They didn't want to be de-individuated, meaning we had numbers on the front and back of their smocks. So the guards, I should mention, the guards went with me to an Army Navy store and picked out, military style uniforms. But the prisoners simply had a smock on with no underpants and just a number sewn on the front and the back. In fact, curiously, the number was Boy Scout numbers that Boy Scouts have on their uniforms. And so they rebelled, meaning they got a cord, rope somewhere, and roped the bars on the doors, to the bottom of their bed, so the guards couldn't open it. And then they made the mistake of yelling through the bars at the guards. cursing them, saying, when we get out, we're going to kick your ass, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, I was sleeping upstairs. I spent a whole week in sleeping in a convertible couch in my office on the second floor of the psych department. I come running down and I say, what's happening? The prisoners are rebelling. What should we do? I said, it's your prison. What do you want to do? They said, well, we can't handle this ourselves because there's only 3 guards on that shift. I said, okay, why don't you call in all the guards on all the shifts and all the standby? And they do. And they come in and they literally break the door down, drag the prisoners out. This physical confrontation. It's the only time. And then what they do is they strip all the prisoners naked, exactly as happened some years later in Abu Ghraib, and tied them up, used the rope that the prisoners had used to barricade this up, literally tied them up. They're lying on the floor naked. Now, we don't even have any images of that because it was all, so overwhelming. And then put them in a closet, 2 at a time, in a closet of solitary confinement. And at that moment, one of the guards said, these are dangerous prisoners, and everything changed. So that's really the key to the study. If that event didn't happen, I probably would have ended the study by the second day and say, it's not worth investigating. But that changed everything, because then the guard said, these are dangerous prisoners. And other guards said, we have to show them who is in charge, who's the boss. And at that moment, all the guards on every shift took it very seriously. And seriously means they had to demonstrate power, that they had the power and prisoners had none. And the prisoners who were most rebellious were abused most frequently. And the guy who was the first prisoner who was arrested by the police, named Doug Corpy, he was prisoner 8612, and he was the ringleader of the rebellion. So the guards really singled him out for abuse, making him do push-ups and all kinds of stuff, having other prisoners step on his back when he was doing push-ups, putting him in solitary confinement. And after 36 hours from the start of the study, Doug Corpy was the first prisoner to have an emotional breakdown, had to be released. And then each day thereafter, he became a pattern of how to get out. Now, it's not clear whether they were faking, but I thought that the emotional breakdowns were real. Now, these are emotional breakdowns in college students who we had pre-tested to be normal and healthy, psychologically, physically, and in a short time, they have emotional breakdowns. And so this went on for 5 days. And the other things we did to make the study very, have a lot of verisimilitude, very realistic. We had any prisoner who wanted to be released after the second day could appeal to go before the parole board. And the parole board was headed by an ex-convict, a buddy of mine, Carlo Prescott, whose parole had been refused 17 years in a row before he finally got out. So he became the cruel parole board head, humiliating the prisoners. And then we had parents, boyfriends, girlfriends come down, visiting times. And so we try to build into the situation all of the elements that happen in a real prison. And I made the mistake of taking the role of superintendent of the prison, because everybody had a role. Jaffe was the warden, Craig Haney and Kurt Banks were the lieutenants. So I made a mistake of saying, I'll be the superintendent. I should have only been the principal investigator, the researcher, because once I accepted that role of superintendent, then I suddenly had a personal allegiance to my guards, to my institution. And the only positive thing I kept saying to the guards, no physical abuse after that first day, but I allowed incredible psychological abuse, which led to 5 prisoners having breakdowns in 5 days. So that's the thing I'm really sorry about in retrospect. And so the study went on for 5 days, and the abuse was worse and worse, but I didn't see it as worse and worse. I saw it as the dynamics of the situation. I saw each guard shift that did these horrible things, and they weren't horrible, they were just what guards do. And what we could see is in the video, we have, I guess, 30 hours No, we have 12 hours of videos and 30 hours of audio tapes. And I should say, all of this is in the archives of Stanford University, available to anyone, along with all of the observations we made, all the guards, all the reports. And also after the experiment was over, we had everybody write down their retrospective analysis of the study. So it's there for anybody who wants can get access to everything that was in that study. And so it's now Thursday night. We start Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We're almost halfway through. And my girlfriend, Christina Maslach, who had graduated from Stanford in social psychology, had just gotten a job at Berkeley. And we had begun to date, and we were thinking, well, maybe we should live together. And I was single, she was single, and maybe if things work out, we could get married, spend a life together. So she calls me. She said, I'm in the library. How about at the end of the night, we have a late dinner. And so she comes down, and we didn't have a one-way screen. What we had was just a slit, a circle in the wall, and we had a video camera there, and we were looking at everything on a computer screen. And I think that also led to the separation of emotion. So what's happening is almost not real. I mean, you're not looking out, seeing it. You're looking at one level back. You're looking at a screen of an event taking place outside. So I'm sitting there, and she comes down, and I'm looking at the screen. And this is now 10 o'clock was the last time prisoners could go to the toilet. After that, they have to urinate or defecate in buckets in their cell, which they hated to do because it smelled all night. But the guards on the night shift use this as the last opportunity to dehumanize the prisoners. What did they do? They put bags over their head. They chain their legs one to another like a chain gang, and they're yelling and cursing and pushing them. And the toilet was literally around the corridor, but they put them in the elevators, brought them up to the fourth floor, walked around, took them down in a different elevator. So the prisoners would be confused. And I look at it and say, Chris, look at this. It's the dynamics of the social situation. We've never seen this before, up close and personal. And she begins to tear up, says, I can't look at this. It's horrible, and runs out. And I run after her. So we're in front of, in the promenade in front of the Jordan Hall, which incidentally, it's not going to be called Jordan Hall anymore, because Jordan turns out to be a racist. But it still was there, labeled Jordan Hall. And I'm trying to convince her to reframe what she's seeing as the power of the situation, up close and personal. And she stops and says, I don't understand you, that you have been changed by this situation. These are not prisoners. They're students. And you have a reputation. You love students. Students love you. And these are not guards, they're students. And what you're doing is reprehensible. And I'm not even listening. I'm saying, wait a minute, you don't understand. She said, wait, you don't understand. If this is the real you, I don't want to continue our personal relationship. And that was the slap in the face. That was the wake-up call. So she never said you should end the study. She said, really, come to your senses. And what it really meant was, I had been changed by being the superintendent of this prison, caring more about my guards than about the prisoners, caring more about the continuity of my institution than the prisoner health and well-being. And at that moment, I said, okay, I'll end the study tomorrow. We had dinner. I started thinking about all the things we had to do to end the study. And so the study ended on Friday, after beginning on Monday. And so that's and then of course we spend the whole day with debriefing, 2 hours with all the prisoners, 2 hours with all the guards, and 2 hours guards and prisoners together. And again, a lot of that we have available on video. So that's my overview.
What was your original inspiration to do this study?
It was really abstract. I mean, I had no interest in prison before this. I mean, I'll talk about interest later. So it's not like I was always interested in prison, was concerned about the terrible things that are happening in prison. It was simply what kind of situation, what is a situation where there are clearest diametrically opposed roles? And I thought, well, it could be camp counselors and campers. And we often heard about terrible things that would happen in camps, but I thought, no, prison guard and prisoner are, the biggest power differential. But then after the study, of course, I got interested in what's happening in real prisons. After the study got immediate notoriety because we ended on Friday, and on Saturday in San Quentin Prison, which is an hour from where I live in San Francisco, there was an alleged escape attempt by a Black prison advocate who allegedly somehow got a gun, went into a gun. He was in jail, smuggled in, and then he released all the prisoners who were in solitary confinement, which again doesn't exist anymore, and many of them killed guards. And he was George Jackson. He was killed, allegedly escaping by climbing a 30-foot wall in daytime. So it was always clear that it was a setup to get him. But so this happened the day after the study ended, and the associate Warden Park, was on television, and talking about how terrible this was. And one of the interviewers, who was from the TV station, that's the other thing, KGO TV in San Francisco, they were the station that I told that I'm doing this study, and I would give them permission to come down and videotape the arrests, as well as from time to time during the week. And they asked the warden, well, could this have happened because of the way guards dehumanize prisoners, as was shown in that psychology study? And he said, oh, that's all bullshit. And then the next day, they asked me to come down and have a debate with him. And so suddenly this study became real. And then there was 3 weeks later at Attica Prison in New York State, prisoners rebelled in honor of George Jackson, and they took over the prison. The guards took over the prison, and the prisoners took over the prison and made the guards their prisoners. And this went on for more than a month. It was a big celebrity event. I mean, it made the newspapers, because it's never happened before that a huge prison was taken over and run by the prisoners for 1 whole week, 1 whole month, I'm sorry. And celebrities came down, people took sides, supporting the prisons. And it made prisons, it brought prisons and prison conditions to public light. And I should mention that the way the prison takeover ended was Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York, ordered state police or military to come in with helicopters and machine gun everybody on the yard. And literally they killed some of the guards who were, tied up. And then they broke into the prison and then took over the prison. And there were these horrendous pictures of every single prisoner there, naked, lined up, handcuffed, in this big snake chain. And at that point, there was congressional investigation about prisons. I was asked to go to Washington to describe, not only my experiment, but what I thought about prison conditions. And I instantly became a prison reformer. And I should mention also Craig Haney, my graduate student, in addition to getting his PhD in psychology, stayed on and got a law degree. And he was one of the first people in psychology and law. And he teaches at University of California, Santa Cruz. And he's become a very powerful spokesman for prison reform. He's given testimony before the Supreme Court about cruel and unusual punishment of solitary confinement, which doesn't exist in the way it used to be. And so Craig Haney is a positive outcome of what Craig Haney has done all of his life, is one of the most positive outcomes of the study. And so after the study, I didn't write anything about it. I wrote 2 little articles, mostly to give Craig and Kurt publication. That made them senior author. And I just felt there was more going on. I was too close to it. There was more going on than I personally had to process. And then I started doing research on time perspective, because time was distorted the study. I started doing research on the psychology of shyness, because shyness I conceptualize as a self-imposed psychological prison, where you are your own prisoner and your own guard. And it wasn't until I got involved as an expert witness for one of the guards at Abu Ghraib, I guess that's 2004, and I got to see all of the 1,000 images, the videos, which I still have. They've all been I don't know what to say. They've all been classified as not public viewing. But I looked at all of those, and then the lawyer for one of the guards asked me to be his expert witness. His name was Chip Frederick, and he was a staff sergeant in charge of the night shift, and all the abuses took place only on the night shift, not in the day shift. That's, again, a situational variable you could talk about. And essentially, when this became public, it was a huge humiliation for America. Here, you're supposed to be helping, bring justice to the world, and you're psychologically, physically, sexually abusing these prisoners night after night after night for 3 months. And so I got to see all these pictures, and it was horrible. Still is horrible. But this guy, Chip Frederick, was a really nice guy. I mean, he's a wonderful man, a wonderful father. Everybody I spoke to loved him. And it turns out that he got caught up in that situation. When he came down there, he was reassigned to, the abuses had already been taking place. Now, the reason guards were there is they were interrogating all of the Iraqi prisoners to find out information about terrorist attacks, terrorist events. In most cases, the prisoners had nothing to say. They were low-level, soldiers. And he got caught up in it. So it was really the power of the situation to make this good guy also do bad things. So he is the one who thought of the terrible punishment of having a prisoner stand on a box, putting a hood over his head, and putting electrodes on his fingertips, and telling him, when your legs give out and you fall off the box, you will electrocute yourself. And so again, you have to imagine what it was like to be in that hood, knowing that at some point your legs are going to go, you're going to get fatigued, you're going to fall off the box, and you will electrocute yourself. Now, Chip Frederick and the others thought it was funny. They were standing looking at it, and there's a picture of it. They had, because when he fell off the box, nothing would happen, and everybody would laugh and say, "Aha, we fooled you." But this is the kind of cruel context that emerges once you're in that situation. So I just want to end with this saying, so the American military put him on trial, and the American military attorney said, we want to throw the book at him. We want him to go hard labor for 15 years. And I was sent to a secret place in Naples, Italy. I guess I was in Italy for something else. And I made my case to the judge, again, via television. And I say, he's guilty. I mean, Chip Frederick says he's guilty as charged. He's done these things. But, it was a social psychology defense of situational forces. This is a good man who was corrupted by his superiors putting him in a bad situation. And I got his sentence reduced from 15 years to 4. He served 4 years, but it's one of the first times a social psychology defense had a powerful legal positive effect. Okay. So with that, I guess I'm open for questions.
Phil, one question, we noticed that it was the US Office of Naval Research that funded the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Yeah, now what happened, that's always been a problem, is because that was money left over from previous research. That was research I was doing on the psychology of de-individuation. You know, putting Stanford College co-eds in hoods, or making them identifiable and putting them in a situation where they could deliver electric shocks to another woman they saw on the screen. So the money came. It was like $2,000 left over from that other grant, and I just said, could I use that money for something new? So the Office of Naval Research knew nothing about this other study. They said, sure, the money's left over. You know, we have no way to process leftover money. So the Stanford Prison Experiment, that whole experiment was done for $2,200. And it was mostly to pay salaries, $15 a day, and to buy beds and things.
Today, probably it would not happen because of the human review boards, but what do you think about how can people do research on extreme situations, you know, behavior in extreme situations? How can you put people in extreme situations if you can't do the research?
Well, you can't. I mean,
You just can't.
no, I mean, Stanley Milgram's research, which preceded mine by 10 years. I should mention for your audience that little Stanley Milgram and little Phil Zimbardo were in the same high school class at James Monroe High School in the Bronx. Literally, we sat next to each other. and we talked about situational forces then. He was concerned, he was Jewish, and it was 1948 when we were in the class together. It was only a few years from the end of the war. And he was concerned about whether he or his family could ever be arrested and sent to a concentration camp. And, you know, you're a mindless high school kid then. It was not one of the fancy high schools, you know. This is James Monroe High School. It's like a middle level school for ordinary kids. And everybody kept saying, Stanley, we're not that kind of people. Don't be silly. And then I could still remember, it rings in my ear, him saying, I'll bet they said the same thing then. We're not that kind of people, until those Hitler Jugend were put in the situation to guard Jews, to arrest Jews, etc. And so then Milgram went on to do his famous blind obedience to authority studies. But again, that study lasted 1 hour. I mean, all of the research before the Stanford Prison Experiment, with the exception of the Turkish guy, Scott will know. What?
Muzaffar Sharif.
Muzaffar Sharif did a study where he got kids in an alleged summer camp, and he created a conflict between them. But aside from his study, all research, famous studies by Solomon Asch on conformity, it took place 1 hour during a student's curriculum. That is, you went, and so the Stanford Prison study, we got to see change over hour after hour, day after day, and that's one of the things that made the study unique. So Milgram's study first became the source of ethics concern only because he made a movie of it. And in the movie, you could see the incredible stress that people were under. Now, these were men ages 20 to 50, not students. And so when you see that movie, and he wanted to be a filmmaker, that was his ambition in life. And it's because he made that film that people first began to say this is unethical. And there were big debates between Stanley and other critics. But but nothing came of it. But in the Stanford Prison Experiment, that once there was all the media attention paid to it, once people got to see the Quiet Rage video that I made with one of my undergraduate students at Stanford, then it was clear that there can never be any experiment done which puts human participants at any level of stress or risk. And so all research now has become imaginary. Oh, imagine you were in a situation and you were a guard or you were the prisoner, what would you do? So the prison study now is in a capsule. It's like a time capsule, and you take it out 50 years later. Say, wow, look what happened back in 1971. Isn't that quaint?
Mhm. So yeah, so we would never do it again, and people know about it, but we still dehumanize prisoners all the time. And in the Lucifer effect, you actually say dehumanization occurs when a human being is considered less and is excluded from the moral order. Is there any way, can someone who's been dehumanized be rehumanized?
It becomes harder. I mean, again, after the study was over, I then got involved in prison. I mean, I said literally before, I never thought about prisons, and afterwards I got very much involved in prisons. My team then, we had a team, and not only Kurt and Craig, but others in the psych department got interested in this, and we actually set up some courses at Plous Prison and other places. And I met with the director of prisons of California, Commissioner Procunier, talking about how we could improve the quality of life of prisoners in prisons. And my concern at that time was there was something like 700,000 American citizens in prisons throughout the United States. And I said, that's got to be reduced. That's really terrible. Right now, it's 2.2 million. You know, so I couldn't imagine 700,000, and now it's staggering, as you know. 2 million people are in prison. One of the problems, there's fewer prisoners in long-term prison sentence. Most sentences are 3 to 7 years, where before it was 7 and beyond that. But it doesn't matter. To be in prison for 3 years is horrendous. And the other problem always was, even then I talked to Procunier, why can't you set up, why can't prisoners have, why can't prisoners be educational? Why can't prisoners learn how to do computer coding? Simple things. That is, why can't they use this time constructively rather than, in those days, prisons, in some they made license plates, some stupid thing that has no value after you get out of prison. So you want to, so I'm saying, given that they have 3 to 7 years in this place, why not develop in each prison some kinds of programs that they are doing, learning something useful, having a product that is useful to society that you get for essentially free, and that when they come out, they have a job possibility. And he said, yes, that sounds good, but didn't do anything.
Okay, another thing you said in the Lucifer effect was that our criminal justice system over relies on common sense held views by the public and about what causes people to commit crimes. And politicians are motivated by that stuff, and why, we have lock them up, they did the crime kind of stuff. What do you have any ideas, alternative basis of judgment that the public could, that we could change this whole, because we've had the prison year experiment for all these years, and yet we still have dehumanization.
Yeah, it's what's even worse, and I heard that President Biden is going to get rid. We now have private prisons. Prisons run for profit. PFP, prisons run for profits. And from everything I know, they're even worse, because if you want to make a profit, you have to have the cheapest food. You're not going to have time. You're not going to have a gymnasium. You're not going to have anything else. So this is horrendous. And I'm hoping, and we're trying to put pressure on Biden to actually eliminate private prisons. That's a start. But the problem is there's not a large enough public voice to say on, and and aside from federal prisons are state run. So there's got to be pressure put on the governor of the state, the mayor in the town where the prison is, to begin to develop constructive programs for prisoners to be involved in. That is, how to use the time, as we said earlier, wisely and well, when they are there. So when they come out, they can get a job. I mean, if you get out of prison after 3 and you're a prisoner, it's on your record. Who wants to hire you? And well, they could hire you if you have a special skill. Well, you could be a dental. So think of a dental assistant. You just think of what an X-ray technician. There are a lot of jobs just come to mind that would be easy to teach prisoners in a prison, and that when they come out, they have a potential occupation and a special skill. So that's the main thing I would say about, for me, from prison reform, that give the prisoners education and training, given we're all teachers, so that when they come out, they can be of value to the community, to the society, rather than a burden.
Okay, I'm gonna, our intern Hannah wants to ask a question. So Hannah, and then Hannah's also gonna go over, we've got questions from the audience.
Okay, Hannah.
That's me. All right, so you already kind of touched on this, but I was wondering, what would an ideal ethical prison look like? Or, is the act of imprisonment inherently unethical?
Is the act of imprisonment? No, okay, so the whole question begins with, what happens when someone breaks the law, when somebody breaks the rules? Okay, so you can start in classes. What happens when a student in the class breaks the rules of the class, talks when the teacher says, pay attention, don't talk, cheats on an exam, steals from other students? So in any lawful society, there have to be consequences for being a bad citizen of the society. And, and so I think that's where we have to start. There, in every situation, so you start in a family. What happens when in a family, a child does something wrong? And what happens in a classroom? What happens in the military? What happens in prison? So prisons are just one unusual setting where a lot of people are put there because they've done something wrong. So it's one of the options that society has to say. Now, again, what happens when somebody is not in control of his own mind and behavior? Then they get put in a mental institution. They used to get put in a mental institution. And so now we've eliminated most mental institutions, partly because they're too costly, not because they weren't doing any good. So that's, for me, that's the big problem, is we have to have, again, renew the dialogue about what can be done in a constructive way when someone breaks the rules or the law of society, lies, cheats, steals. Now, the biggest problem, the reason there are 2.2 million people in prison, had primarily to do with drugs, heroin, cocaine, taking drugs, selling drugs. And again, this is largely minority populations. So of these millions of people in jail for long terms, it's disproportionately so with lower class men and women from minority populations. And I forgot, maybe it was Ronald Reagan's time, where there was the war on drugs. I think that maybe, yeah. and so, but again, I think it's stepping back and saying, you know, we need some way to get people, have people be concerned about not breaking the laws, and the laws are meant to create harmony between citizens. In the same way, laws are made in a family to have harmony between parents and children, and children and children.
So they could do, so do you, they could do restorative justice, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So again, it's, but why this, your concept has been around such a long time. Why hasn't it been incorporated into more state programs? That is, you broke the law and now you have to, you know, you have to do something to make up for it. And, you know, the other problem is recidivism. I mean, to show that prisons don't work is that a huge number of prisoners who are released from prison after doing their time break the law again and go back, because, you know, for whatever reason. Now, one reason is if you're relatively uneducated, if you have a prison sentence, you know, if you're a felon, then you're never going to get a job. So the way you're going to survive is you're going to have to lie and not lie. You're going to have to steal, et cetera, or sell drugs. You know, so that's the terrible cycle of criminality, that you start off not being, you're not a criminal, you just need to get some money, you need to feed your family, and you steal or et cetera, and you get caught. You know, and again, most people, again, you could say in a society, most people don't get caught for relatively small offenses, but it's yeah. So the question I ask you is, why hasn't restorative justice had a bigger impact on our prisons and on our politicians?
I think it's actually a pretty new field. I mean, it only started really in the 1970s. Today, there's not even a consensus on what the definition is of it, you know? So, I mean, I think it's still kind of new. So that's what I think. I also worry about embedding restorative justice programs with government. You know, what I've seen when prosecutors do restorative justice is terrible. You know, they limit it to only people who've been harmed. They don't even allow, in Hawaii, we had some people say that restorative justice was only to benefit the people who were hurt. So, you know, they didn't even want any benefits for people who did something wrong, which is ridiculous, because most of the people in prison that I work with, a lot of them, they don't even know who they hurt. So how could they ever, you know what I mean, meet with the person or have that person want to have it? They don't even know. And and the people who've been hurt too don't know who did it. You know, a lot of 70% of all crime in the US goes without anyone being identified, arrested. You know, they don't know. It's a lot of theft and stuff. So you don't know who it is who ripped off your house. But go ahead, Hannah. Hannah had more.
It's okay. I'm actually going to run and do the Q&A from like the audience, just because I think there's some really great questions coming in.
Okay.
Specifically from Heejin Lee. I hope that's how I pronounce it. She's interested, or they're interested in the after effects of situational studies. So, you know, after people have been put in these situations, does that change their behavior outside of that situation? Is something in their kind of core behavioral self change after being put in a situation like the Stanford Prison Experiment?
Well, we do have evidence that we have done follow-ups with everybody who's in our study for several years, and one of the filmmakers that are making this documentary have contacted a number of prisoners and guards recently, and almost every one of them said that in retrospect, they valued their experience as a prisoner, as a guard. And all of them said, you know, they wish they could do it again, because now they would be in a better position to be a more effective guard without being sadistic, or a prisoner who gave support to other prisoners. I mean, one of the curious things we've never talked about is, when prisoners live closely, 3 in a cell. When one of the prisoners started having an emotional breakdown, we have no evidence that the other 2 prisoners in his cell gave him any support. So essentially, it was the prisoners were really self-isolated. And one of the prisoners started having a breakdown. They just ignored him. And then that made it even worse. So there was no prisoner solidarity. Now, again, you could say, well, you're only going to be there a couple of weeks, but still, you're a college student, you're the same age, similar background. You just finished summer school at Stanford or Cal. It was, again, we bugged the cells, and there was not a single bit of evidence that any of the prisoners said, come on, guy, pull it together. You're in this together. You just have to not get on this guy's shit list. So essentially, it's there was no evidence of any kind of support that prisoners gave each other. And that I think that made it worse. Once you start down that slippery slope of hopelessness, then there was nobody holding you up, nobody giving you a buffer.
I'm just going to say, I work a lot with women in prison, and I've noticed they have tremendous support and compassion for each other. So I'm just wondering if in your case, it was all men,
Oh yeah, different. It is a big difference. I think, I mean, again, it's the male personal isolation with women are always more sociocentric. So that males in general in society are more socially isolated from each other. And women are more, but there's no reason why that model from female prisons can't be brought into male prisons. And, but again, this is, but how do you do that? It's one thing for me to say, but how do you do it? How do you get male prisoners to care about other male prisoners?
Some of our men, I've worked with men too, and I've seen a lot of, we call it in Hawaii, aloha, care for each other. I've seen the men too, but they were they'd been together for some time. It wasn't like 5 days. They'd been together over time. Maybe that, I don't know, but go ahead. Ask more, the other questions.
Ooh, yes, there's one from Alana Abramson, and she was curious as to your personal story, seeing as you're a proponent of restorative justice, have you taken part in any restorative practices with the people who were involved in the Stanford Prison Experiment?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, in addition to the debriefing we did that day, they all came back 2 weeks later, a month later. I had them write stories about their experience, retrospective, and some of them we literally followed up for a long time, in order to see, how this little experiment shaped them. So a great case in point is Doug Corpy, prisoner 3612, the first one to get arrested, the first one to break down. It changed his whole life for the better. What does that mean? He got a PhD in clinical psychology at Berkeley, and for the past, I guess he's retired now, 30 or 40 years, he was the prison psychologist in the San Francisco County Jail. That is, he took this experience and said, and he said explicitly, he said, I want to help create situations where prisoners respect one another, and guards are simply there to prevent prisoners from doing anything wrong, but there's a mutual respect between prisoners and guards. And essentially what he's saying is the phrase quiet rage that I use on the video that we distribute, and I should mention I have 20 copies left that we can give you to distribute, and money could go to your program. That is that what he said was that his job as a prison psychologist is to raise the dignity of prisoners and reduce the quiet rage that is in every guard once the guard becomes aware of how much power he has. So I use that phrase, quiet rage. That is, guards don't show it, but over time, because guards are always afraid. I mean, in every prison, there are many, many prisoners to very few guards. And every guard knows that these prisoners have killed guards in the past, that prisoners are creative. They make weapons out of anything, things you can't even imagine. Make a weapon out of a toothbrush, and if you put it in a guard's eye, you could blind him. So essentially, what Doug Corpy has been doing, so I would think him as the single best example of the positive power of the Stanford Prison Experiment, of a prisoner who had an emotional breakdown, that the guards abused the most, and that he comes out of this and spends his whole life as a prison guard in the San Francisco County jails, trying to make that setting better for both the prisoners and the guards.
So and the San Francisco jails where Sonny Schwartz did that program, right? The restorative justice.
Yes.
So probably that's really great, because that study was just, there was a whole chapter dedicated to it in a very popular domestic violence book called No Visible Bruises. So that's
right. I know that. Yeah, I know that.
Good outcome. Yeah.
And it's, so I have to, actually, I should get in touch with him I'm not sure he's still alive because it's 50 years. And I realize all those little students are now in their 70s. But yeah, this reminds me, after this, I will try to check Doug Corpy out and see what he's doing. Okay.
Hannah, do you have more?
Yes. So from Kazumasa Umemoto in Japan, he has a really interesting question about practicing these situational powers in psychology. Obviously, it's not ethical to do them in person. You can't. But what is the potential for using online servers and avatars to kind of study these situations?
Well, that's a good question. I never thought about that. Maybe Scott would have a better idea. So that means to create an online prison with avatars. Prison. It's a great idea. It's a fascinating idea. I don't have a good answer for it. It'd be worth trying. Now, see, one of the problems that I see is that not only can a researcher do experiments in which participants experience stress of any kind, I have been told that you can't have people imagine a stressful situation. Imagine a situation that would put them in stress. So suppose I wanted to do research on the psychology of forgiveness, about which is very little known. We want to know what are the circumstances, the conditions under which you would forgive someone who has been abusive toward you. Okay, so essentially, it's you could imagine having one group of female participants to say, imagine that someone has raped you, and we have caught him, and he wants you to forgive him, and essentially, what we're going to vary is the kinds of forgiveness arrangements. You cannot do that because having somebody imagine a stressful situation of being raped is too extreme. So this really, if you think about that, it limits any kind of psychological research on profound human concepts like the nature of forgiveness. So, but I'd love to hear him develop that prison avatar.
Yeah, so Heejin Lee actually just posted in the chat that apparently there was a virtual version of Stanley Milgram's experiment done in 2006 that we could look into. Anyway,
Yeah.
just to note.
No, I don't know that. We should look at, yeah.
Another question I had was, in The Lucifer Effect, you briefly introduced C.S. Lewis's inner ring theory, social in-grouping and out-grouping. And I was just wondering, in a place that is so socially limited, like prison, how does that play out, like the human desire to be a part of a group?
Oh, most prisons are all about groups, and the groups are almost always racial. I mean, um, I mean, you cannot survive in a prison as an individual. When you get into prison, I mean, before you get into prison, once you're arrested and once you're given a sentence, that there are people in the prison who will know that you're coming, okay, and they will find out, are you an isolate? Are you have you been part of a gang? Have you been part of a social group? And when you are alone, then you will be abused. That, I mean, in many cases, you'll be sexually abused, because that's one of the ways in which most male prisons differ from female prisons. The older, tougher men who've been there for years, they almost have gangs, and in many cases, a new young male prisoner will be bought for cigarettes, cartons of cigarettes, and become his sissy or his boy or his girlfriend. And the only way that you can prevent that is for you to be part of a gang of Blacks, of Puerto Ricans, of Sicilians, whatever, and that you need your position, your presence in a gang of like similar appearing people, to help protect you against the abuses of other gangs. And so again, it's that is also one of the worst things about most male prisons, is that it's now, and there's a lot of evidence that guards encourage that, because if prisoners are fighting with prisoners, they're not fighting against you.
That's so interesting, that last note.
Yeah.
Okay, so from M. Brown, they are wondering, how can we work to kind of push with legislation that's going to help prison reform, or specifically, like, what deserves our backing?
Yeah, well, again, I don't know enough about the politics, and it varies so much in each state, each country. We need more model examples. I mean, we need more examples of model prisons. Now we have some from other countries, and so what we have to convince politicians is that creating a more humanized prison, in the long run, is cheaper. That you can have less guards, less surveillance. If prisons are doing some constructive work, that constructive work can pay their way, that it can be used to make useful products. But I think the bottom line is nobody gives a shit about prisons. To put it, I mean, we all do, but essentially, the only time anyone knows about what's happening in prisons is when prisoners riot, and they almost always riot in order to get public attention. But they rarely do. I mean, when was the last time we heard of a prison riot? I mean, it's hard to even think about it. And so prisons are like the state secret. They're there, they're everywhere. There's millions of people put in prisons. It costs us I guess, billions of dollars of our money, our hard taxpayers' money, that could be used in so many better ways. And we don't know what's happening in prisons. We don't think, we don't know, not only don't we know, we don't care, we don't think about it. So again, it's how do we get people on this panel to begin to start not only restorative justice, but prison reform at a most fundamental level. That we want to have fewer people in prison. We want to have shorter prison sentences. We want to have prisoners paroled as early as possible, and we want to have prisoners learning skills that are useful skills when they are in prison, using that time in a positive educational way.
And we want bail reform, and we want some of the laws changed to decriminalize some behavior, especially substance abuse, like
Right.
Portugal. I wanted to ask you, Phil, have you ever heard of the Brazilian prison called APAC, the
Yes.
Association for the Condemned Person? I mean, the protection of the condemned person. It's an incredible model. I visited it. I spent the night there in Brazil, and it's the prisoners run the prison. The prisoners are the guards. They have the keys, and it's a remarkable place. It's like a school almost.
Right.
And the people have so much care, and they were men. The prison I spent the night at was a men's prison, and a bunch of them were in cells that day. And I said, "Why are you in a cell?" And they said, "Once a month, we go in a cell to show our camaraderie for the other Brazilian prisoners who are in the state prisons. We do it as a show of solidarity." So, just as a symbolic thing. The thing with that prison is that it's faith-based. And so applying a faith-based model in the United States is pretty hard. There's already been a case on it, and it was not allowed.
No, so faith-based means that they're all Catholic?
Christian. It was Christian, but they have some in Nigeria that are Muslim. They follow Islamic stuff. And I mean, I think you could do it without, you could just, like, instead of having religion, you could have like, ethical standards, right? Like a book. The guy who started that prison in Brazil, this guy, Mario Ottoboni, he's died now, but he was a young lawyer at your age. He was like your age. And he, in the 1971 or something, he said he heard there was a lot of prison riots in Brazil. And he said he heard the voice of God. He was a Catholic.
Wow.
And God told him, "Mario, you must do something about the prisons." And so he just got into prison reform and said, our church is going to take over. They asked, "Can we take over a prison?" And the Brazilian government said yes. And then now they have about 60 or 70, and they're trying to do more. They do them in South America more.
Wow, no, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, I'll send you a paper about it.
Okay,
but,
sure.
Yeah. And our thing, we do this reentry process, where the people in prison, they meet with their loved ones and they want to make amends with them. And then they make a plan for how they're going to earn a living and what they're going to do, housing, and take care of all their reentry needs. And we did research it. We had it independently evaluated, and it does reduce recidivism.
Wow.
It reduces recidivism, and it's also cost effective. We just did did research on the cost and benefits, and it's really worth it. But then it goes back to that question of yours, that it's the public has these common sense, and even our politicians in Hawaii, like, none of them have been interested in doing this reentry thing in our state prisons. Basically,
Yes.
I mean, a couple have, but they haven't done it. We've been doing it for 15 years, this research.
Yeah, but again, the problem now, everything you said is worse in the pandemic, because there are no jobs for anybody, let alone a former felon, ex-convict, whatever label you want to put on them. So I hadn't thought about that, but given how hard it is for anybody to get a job in most places, if there's any reason not to hire you, that's going to dominate. So that, why would you hire an ex-convict when there was somebody who was a law-abiding citizen who also wants that same job, and it's not available for anybody?
Right.
That's a big problem.
Yeah.
probably face now.
Yeah. Our state of education, our department, we have a state Department of Education, and they're actually going to work with us for these tutors that we're training to be tutors, the imprisoned women. They're going to get, if the curriculum
Great.
meets their muster, and if it's robust enough, they're going to give them some kind of a certificate. So that, and the guy I talked to at the Department of Education, he said he will hire them because they need tutors. They need certified tutors.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the way to do it. To start with, where is there a domain in any city, any state, where they need some kinds of skilled labor that doesn't exist, and so now you have this supply of people in prisons who all you have to do is train them in that skill. But it needs somebody like you who steps back and say, where is there a need, and how can we fulfill that need by having training programs either in prison or for ex-convicts. I don't know what you want to call them, and that means people are happy to use them because they have this special skill. For sure, that's.
Our board, actually our board of directors, we have 2 formerly incarcerated people on our board, and they bring so much diversity. They have such good ideas, and we've been so lucky, to have them on the board. And yeah, we're trying to get more people. We've got people now who've come out of prison, got master's degrees, and someone who's also in a PhD program. So we're really excited.
Yay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We think they can really do a lot to change things, those people. So I think Scott was going to tell us more about the heroic program.
Okay.
Because we're an hour and a half. I don't want to take all your time, Phil, but
okay.
And you can tell them too about the webinar, Scott, in a couple weeks.
Oh, well, the Heroic Imagination Project is Phil's project, not mine.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So, but I was simply signaling that I think that that's very groundbreaking, inspiring work. It started about a dozen years ago. And Phil, do you want to say something about it? He spends far more time on that than on the Stanford Prison Experiment these days.
Oh yeah. So actually, if you read chapter 16 in the Lucifer Effect, I start by saying, in the past 15 chapters, we have seen how easy it is for good people to turn evil, which is the subtitle of the book. Now I want to raise the possibility, have you think about, can ordinary people be trained to become heroes? And so as soon as you ask that question, people will say, well, no, because we think heroes are special kinds of people. And I'm saying, no, we have to change our definition of hero. Heroes are people who come to the aid of others in need, or in defense of a moral cause, aware that there's possible personal danger in the case. And then I go through and I have a taxonomy of 12 different kinds of heroes. And then I end by saying, I think it is possible to train ordinary people in how to be a hero. And after that, I also gave a talk at the TED conference about the same time called The Psychology of Evil. And at the end of that talk, I say the same exact thing. And from that time, I got such a positive feedback. I said, well, let me start a nonprofit foundation in San Francisco called the Heroic Imagination Project, meaning to be a hero, it starts in your imagination. I could be one, rather than, because when we think of heroes, we think of the names that come to mind are internationally famous. It's Mother Teresa, it's Martin Luther King, it's Nelson Mandela, it's Madame Curie, etc. And I'm saying, no, it's ordinary people like any of us who one time in your life is going to do something to help other people. Heroes are sociocentric when most of us are egocentric. So the idea is we want to create a way of thinking where I'm always thinking about what can I do to make the world better for you, by giving you a compliment, by trying to encourage you in some positive way. And then what I did is I developed, I developed a foundation and we started doing research on heroism. It turns out the word hero and heroism does not exist in any psychology textbook. Astounding, and not in any introductory book, nowhere. It was simply not a concept that people thought about. And so we started doing research on the nature of heroism. Then I developed lessons kind of building out on the way I teach psychology at Stanford, with videos, with Q&A, with critical thinking skills. And then I said, so we license these lessons for a small fee, and then to schools. Our lessons are really high school, college, and human relations business. And now we're trying to lower the level so they're good for middle school. And the lessons work. We have lots of evidence that it reduces. We have lessons on prejudice reduction, on passive bystanders becoming active upstanders, people switching from a static fixed mindset to dynamic growth mindset. So each of these are lessons that are 3 or 4 hours long in chunks. And again, these would be great in prison. I mean, we're suffering right now because schools are all closed, so nobody's buying our lesson. And typically I go personally to the site of the people who are buying these lessons, licensing, and I train the trainers. I train groups of teachers or human relations people. And our program now is in 12 countries around the world. It's most vibrant in Hungary, surprisingly, where we started a foundation there called Hero Square, and our program is in every single high school in the entire country of Hungary, and we're all over Poland. We're in many cases in Palermo, Sicily. I'm Sicilian, and I would go to each of these places when we could travel. And we're in the Green School in Bali, in Czech Republic, and many places. And so essentially the idea is it's to turn around the negative of the prison study, to say, can we make ordinary people not only into cruel prisoner guard, but make them into everyday heroes, people whose actions make the world better, and then suddenly it becomes a way of life. So it's all we want you to do is a good deed once. So heroes are not, to be a hero is not in you, it's in what you do. So it's creating a way of thinking that I could do it. And it's the semantics. It's, you stop using I and me, and you begin to use we and us more often. And you're always looking for how can I give a compliment to someone, to say, what a wonderful program you arranged. I'm excited to be here. I hope all of our listeners that have joined in have gotten as much out of it as I have. So it's that way. It's learning to focus on the other is the first step in taking heroic action.
If I could jump in,
I'm sorry.
if I could just jump in and finish the question by screen sharing. This is where you can get more information about this. The website that Phil has is heroicimagination.org. And it's certainly worth checking out if you want to do that. And in terms of the webinar, Lauren, that you mentioned, for people who can't get enough Zimbardo, you can see this flyer. This is an event that's going to take place on March 16th, 1 week before Phil's birthday.
Wow.
Right. And Harold Takushian has done a masterful job of organizing this webinar, a global webinar. And this will focus more on that journey to cultivating and inspiring heroism.
And it's free.
Right.
It is indeed.
It's free. We can send everyone on this, that we'll send them all the
that would be great
from you.
Okay. It'd be really great. Yeah, we're looking
Yeah,
forward
I'll
to
send
it.
What I was going to say too, Phil, that what you're talking about, not being less egocentric, it's a Western thing. I mean, I've noticed in other cultures, they're a lot more about we. You know what I
Right.
mean? They're like way more like the Bali people in Balinese people.
Oh,
And
right.
stuff. You know what I mean? They're way more about other people. It's Westerners
Sure.
are
Yeah.
so just into themselves, right?
Well, we
And,
are.
so somebody did have a question like, do you think the Stanford Prison Experiment would have been different in a different culture? I mean, some places don't even have, and I visited prisons all over.
Yeah.
Some in Spain, they have like 60 people. There's not much bad stuff. No one even wears uniforms. They're shocked when they see we have uniforms. They say, doesn't that dehumanize people? I'm like, yeah, yeah.
That's the reason for it.
Yeah, that's the reason. They were shocked in Italy when I told them, yeah, they don't even let us touch. We're not supposed to touch them. You're not supposed to touch and hug a person in prison.
Right.
It's a rule violation. Actually, I got in trouble. Somebody touched me. It was like, oh.
I can imagine. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So it's a good question. I mean, a thought question. How would the Stanford Prison Study work out in Italy, in Bali, in Portugal? I don't know, but it's worth the audience thinking about that.
Yeah, okay.
I'm gonna have to go now.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for participating in this. You're awesome, Phil. Just big giant love and aloha to you for having this. Yes, and Scott and everyone for coming. It was great to see you, Frank Cullen too, and Melody and everybody. Thank you so much.
And I hope to come back to Hawaii soon.
Yes, come back as soon as you can travel.
Okay.
Yes, I have a place you can stay at the beach.
Okay.
Yeah, my office is on the beach. Yeah, cool.
Office on the beach.
Scott, everybody. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all so much. Aloha. Bye.
Aloha.
Bye, Scott.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Zimbardo.
Okay. Ciao.
She turned off. Yeah.